Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Sams and I manage the Marine and Coastal Sciences Unit and Programs Unit at Parks Victoria. So I'm going to be your guide today through today's presentation. So today we're going to take a look at the diverse and wonderful marine life we find in our marine protected areas. I'm going to weave in some of the science and things we are learning from our monitoring and research programs about what's in our MPAs and how they're tracking. I'm going to try and not get too technical, but if you do have any questions, pop it in the chat box and we'll try to get to it towards the end of the talk. So for those of you not familiar, the chat should just be up here in the top of your Windows, your Teams window just up there. Okay, so before we begin, I'd just like to give an acknowledgement of country. So today I'm beaming to you from Wurundjeri country around the foothills of the Yarra. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, in my case, the Wurundjeri, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the lands that we're transmitting to today, as well as their elders past and present. Before we get into the crux of the talk as well, I'd also like to acknowledge a whole range of people who've contributed to the work that's being presented here today. So there's been a cast of many people who've contributed to this work, and it's really the culmination of many years of work, a lot of the information that I'm sharing today. So I won't be able to name them all because there's a lot and I won't have time, but in particular I'd just like to point out the Deakin University Marine Spatial Lab, led by Associate Professor Daniel Iridicono. So a lot of the work that I'm going to present to you today that's featured here is work that we've been doing in partnership with them, and really that they've been leading and doing all of the getting in the water for us. I'd also like to give a particular acknowledgement to the Parks Victoria regional staff who've supported our monitoring and research programs through collecting data, providing boating and diving assistance, and they've also collected a lot of the images and footage that you'll see in the presentation today. So to begin with today, I'm going to show a series of photographs from different parts of Australia and see if you can work out which of these are from Victoria and how familiar that you are with our marine life. So I've been working in marine ecology and marine sciences in Victoria for close to 15 years now. And when I tell people this, one of the most common responses that I get is, did you study in Queensland or did you work up on the Great Barrier Reef? So there seems to be a perception out there that most of the great marine diversity that we find occurs only up there in those tropical Great Barrier Reefs. But this really isn't true. And so my question earlier is a bit of a trick question. So I'm sure some of you have guessed, but all of the pictures that I'm showing you here are taken from Victorian waters. The title of my talk might have been a bit of a giveaway, perhaps not such a trick. But Victoria has a really colourful, vibrant and rich and species diverse marine environment. And these ecosystems occur across the state. So the pictures that I've shown you today are not particularly rare or unique or hard to find. They're basically everywhere. And so recognising this, Victoria has a system of marine protected areas that span the entire state. And these have been specifically set aside to protect our fantastic marine natural values. So around 11% of the Victoria's marine waters are protected by MPAs. It's between 11 and 12%. And we basically have a network of marine protected area systems that span from the far west here in Discovery Bay all the way up to the far east here at Cape Howe Marine National Park, with a whole network of marine areas dotted all across the state, including in our major marine bays, Port Phillip Bay, Western Port and Corner Inlet down here. Now, there are two broad categories of marine protected areas. There are the coastal and marine parks, and these are multiple use marine protected areas. So these areas, and sorry, these are shown here, if you can see my mouse here, sorry about that, in the light blue. So these areas have been set aside to protect biodiversity to the extent possible, but they also accommodate a variety of uses, including fishing, some extraction, tourism and things like that. The next tier up of these are the marine national parks and the marine sanctuaries. So these are shown in dark blue on this map throughout here. And these have been set aside specifically as strictly no-take reserves. And so they have the purpose of preserving representative diversity and ecological processes for future generations. So the purpose of these reserves is really strictly around conservation and preserving these marine habitats. into the future. One of the other purposes they serve is to act as a reference area for the rest of the state. So because they're largely excluded from human impacts, of course there are some small human impacts, and I should mention people are allowed to access these areas to visit through tourism for diving and things like that, but otherwise they're protected from any activities that would harm and damage them. And because of that, they can act as a reference area that tells us what's going on naturally in our environments, largely outside the influence of human impacts, which is really important for research and understanding the condition of our natural environments. So as marine park managers, it's critical that we understand what's in our parks. So I think there's an old adage, and if this isn't an old adage, let's pretend that it is, but we can't manage what we don't know, and what we don't know is there. So the question for us is what's in our marine parks? So at the most basic level, our marine parks contain two major habitats, so sand and rock. So this might seem obvious and seem quite simplistic, but these are two basic substrates and these support very different marine life. They're basically, you find quite different species and very different ecosystems occurring on sand and rocks, and they represent two of the major breaks in marine habitats. And so by understanding where these two habitats occur inside our marine protected areas, it's actually a really powerful approach for understanding more broadly what's in our marine protected areas. So to give you an example of this, one of the things that we've been working in partnership with Deakin University for quite some years now has been the mapping of the seafloor to understand what habitat types are present. And so one way that we can do this is using something like multi-beam sonar. And so this is Deakin's research vessel, the Yola here. And this is supposed to indicate multi-beam sonar shooting down to the seafloor. And for most of you, I'm sure, are probably pretty familiar with what sonar is. So it's basically sending noise signals down to something and having them bounce back to sensors. And with that, we can measure in really complicated and fine spatial scales develop these three-dimensional models that show the bathymetry, or by bathymetry I mean the depth profiles of what we see on the seafloor. But we can actually go beyond that. So we can measure something like the backscatter of the sonar, which is how rapidly the signal comes back to sensors, how much it's absorbed by the seafloor, and the patterns that it's returning to these sensors to tell us whether we've got soft sediment habitat or hard rocky habitat. And from that, we're able to produce a map, simple maps like this, that give us an idea of where there's rock and where there's sand. And this turns out to be really powerful and useful. It helps us to understand the configuration of what's in our marine parks. And one of the advantages of this approach is that we can use sonar to map entire stretches, like essentially our entire marine parks, to understand where there's likely to be reef habitat, where there's likely to be sand habitat. And we can do that much faster than if we actually went there and tried to physically map all of the creatures and habitat types that we saw there. But what we can do is we can actually take this one step further, and we can use these measures to create a really complicated picture of all of the different environmental conditions that occur across a marine park. So we can measure things like depth, as I've said, but we can also measure things like the complexity of the reef. So I guess how bumpy and how many cracks and crevices, things like that there are in there. The slope of the reef, so how quickly they slope way down to deeper depths. The directions that they face, like the northness and easterness, and these are important because that determines how exposed they are to things like prevailing fast currents or high wave energy. We can include other measures like current speed and wave exposure that we might measure by developing hydrodynamic models, or we'd actually go out there and measure these with different instruments, and measuring things like temperature as well. And from that, we can build up a really detailed picture of what the environments are like across different sections of the marine park. Now, what we can then do is combine this information with actual measurements that we're taking, and I'll show you an example here, and hopefully this video footage beams across to you okay. So these measures can be combined with underwater video footage like this that we use to ground truth the different types of biota we find across different sections of the park and at which depths, which environmental conditions they occur under. And we'd actually use this information to predict and build much more complex maps about what habitats we find in our parks. So we can produce a map like this with these approaches. So this is an example here from Bunurong Marine National Park. And oops, sorry, I just lost my notes here. Let me bring them back. And this gives us an idea. So this map, what this map's showing you here is this is Bunurong Marine National Park here. Then these colours correspond to the depth gradients that are going down here. So we can see it's getting from shallower to deeper. And also what we're seeing here with these black squiggles are the areas where we, or when I say we, Deakin University, have gone out and actually mapped a habitat there. We know what the environmental variables are across this whole area, and so using models we can actually predict with a very high degree of accuracy the types of habitats that we find, and that's shown in a map like this. So these different colours correspond to different habitat types, and these categories here are the broad ways that we classify habitat. I'm not going to go into too much detail right now about what these are. It's a bit esoteric, and we're going to come back to this a bit later. But this is really useful information for us to know as marine protected area managers, because from this we can understand where the habitats are distributed. So if we know there's a particular species that we're looking for or interested in finding more out about that's found in a particular habitat, we know where to go. We know if there's areas that are particularly prone to particular issues, like things like pest species, we can go and find those habitats, as well as just getting a really comprehensive stock take of what's in our parks. But just to take a step back, for these next few slides, I just want to give you and talk you through the different types of habitats that we find within our marine protected areas. And so for these next few, I'm going to focus on what we find in these sandy or sediment type habitats. So there are a range of different types of ecosystems and habitats we find in the sandy parts of our marine protected areas. So a very common one, both inside and outside marine protected areas, are these bare sandy plains, and these are probably very familiar to people who are swimming off beaches. They have these lovely undulating patterns from the waves, but essentially we can think of these to some extent as like the plains or the deserts of the ocean. Not always the case, and we'll come back to that a bit later. However, what we find in the more sheltered areas of our marine protected areas and our coast in general, where there's soft sediment, is that they're dominated by extensive seagrass beds. So I'm just going to show you a video here to give you an example, and hopefully this will beam through to you guys. Okay, so ignore this bit at the start. This is a rock, not what we're talking about right now. But what we find in the sheltered habitats are places like these extensive seagrass beds. This is a species called Amphibolus antarctica, and there are several different species that form these extensive beds. Another example here, Posidonia, and they all have slightly different preferences for the habitats that occur. And the example that you just saw before, in some cases we don't have seagrass beds, but we have these algal beds where it's really sheltered and more conducive to algae. So in these shallow water ecosystems, seagrasses are really critical. They support abundant fish populations. So these include large numbers of schooling fish that live in and out of the complex habitat that seagrasses create. Seagrasses also support really abundant populations of little invertebrates, so crustacean snails, that are a really important food source for these species. And so it's quite common to see large schooling fishes on top of the seagrass. But when you actually dive down and look inside the seagrass, they also house a whole range and diversity of these cryptic species, like this pipefish here, which is camouflaged to look like a little seagrass bed. And if you've ever taken a net through the seagrass, hundreds of these things will come out. So they're just jam-packed with them. They also support iconic species like the weedy sea dragon here, which loves a lot of the seagrass beds. We do find them elsewhere, but they do love the seagrass beds around our southern coast, and it's a great place to go and see them. And one other thing that seagrass beds are really important for is they're a really important nursery system. Fish don't actually live in seagrass beds, but as adults, they school out in the open ocean or they live in the sandy plains. Their offspring and the juveniles will come and live in seagrasses until they've matured enough to become adults and leave. And so in this way, they're really important nursery grounds. And this is true for some species that we know are of really high commercial value. So things like King George whiting are reliant on seagrasses to complete their life cycle and to support their juvenile populations. And so protecting these seagrass beds within our marine protected areas, we're able to ensure that these nursery grounds are available for fish, and these fish, as they grow up, will then spill over out into areas outside MPAs, so supporting those fish populations that leave MPAs and roam more widely. Another really important thing about seagrasses is they're a key component of our blue carbon ecosystems. So blue carbon is the term we use for those ecosystems that draw down and sequester carbon in the ocean. And so seagrasses are quite interesting because they're capable of storing large amounts of carbon relative to their small stature that you can see here on the screen. So on the land, what happens is forests store a lot of carbon, but that usually happens as trees grow and build it into their biomass. And then once they mature, they tend to stop storing carbon at such a high rate. In contrast, seagrasses continually take carbon down into the sediments. And so there's and they'll be able to do that over a long time. So there's a strong capacity for them to sequester carbon. And there's a really strong interest now in how we protect and restore these habitats to help combat climate change. Another quite unique ecosystem that we find in our soft sediment habitats and in extensive areas in some of our marine protected areas are what we call rhodolith beds. So these are a really important component of these sandy sediment ecosystems. So they might look like rocks, but what they really are coralline red algae, so a type of plant that photosynthesizes sunlight. And they grow as these calcified structures and form these large rubble-like beds. So this is what we call biogenic habitats. So this isn't actually algae growing on rocks. The algae themselves are the rocks. So they grow, incorporate calcium into their structure and form these rubble beds. And these also support quite diverse communities of small invertebrates, as well as fish that use the complex habitats that they provide as habitat and shelter. And so in this way, they create these kind of oases of complicated habitat in what can be otherwise these flat, bare, sandy areas. Another type of habitat that we find in sand is a really unusual one, and we can call it sediment epibiota, and epi meaning living on and biota meaning an organism. So in these cases, these are erect sponges, so they're a type of animal that lives on this sand, and this happens where you have this veneer of sand that lives over a rocky reef or has some rock underneath, and they create, in some cases, these really large areas of what probably look like underwater cactus gardens, but a bit more like Salvador Dali or someone like that created them. And we have these really extensive areas in places like Point Addis National Park, which are really quite amazing to swim or dive over and see these weird looking sort of cactus gardens. So even though a lot of habitat in these sandy environments is bare sand, there's still plenty of life to be observed. So this is an example of a method that we use to sample fish in our marine protected areas. It's called a BRUV, a baited remote underwater video. And basically all it is there's bait here and there's obviously a video system that's filming, and we can plonk that down. And one of the advantages of this approach is we can put it in places where it's much harder for divers to access. So a lot of our monitoring in the past has been done by diving, but there's a limit on how deep divers can go, and we can put these in quite deep areas, and we can get footage like this, which allows us to identify and count fish. And what you're seeing here is a classic example of the type of fish that we find in these sandy habitats. So these bottom feeding fish like this fiddler ray here, or the flathead, with camouflage tops, and then these flat bodies for feeding on the ground. And then these silver bodied fish here, like I think this is a trevally, and their silver body helps them camouflage in the water column. Sandy habitats, rocky habitat is rarely bare, so hard surfaces in the ocean are quite limited, and they're highly sought after habitats for marine creatures. So instead of being bare, they're really commonly covered by rich communities of algae and sessile invertebrates. So I'll give a plug to Mark Rodrigue, who's helping to run this talk. He's giving a talk on Monday the 20th, where he's going to delve into much more detail into these amazing algal reefs than I will today. So I definitely recommend and give a plug to getting along to see his talk. He gives a great presentation, so well worth going along to find out more about these habitats. But to give you a bit of information, algae are seaweeds and other plant-like species that photosynthesize light for energy. So they're really important because they draw down the sun's energy to the seafloor, and that energy then gets converted and supports diverse animals that live within them. These types of assemblages are known as sessile epifaunal reefs, So epifaunal again means an animal that lives on something. So they live permanently attached to reefs here. I'm going to call them sponge gardens throughout this talk because that's another term we use, which is much easier to say than epifaunal reef. But just with the caveat that a lot of the creatures that you see here are not sponges at all. So these reefs contain a whole range of invertebrate animals, things like these soft corals, got bryozoans here, also known as a moss animal or a lace coral. We have sponges, as well as other creatures called ascidians as well. So not necessarily dominated by sponges. So sponges feature in them a lot. So we call them sponge gardens. So these reef habitats are the biodiversity hotspots of our marine environments, and they support a really high number of species, as well as a range of really quite different and distinct habitats, often over a quite small area. So I've got another video, which I'm hoping will play nicely for you to kind of demonstrate what we commonly find on our reefs in our marine protected areas. So if we follow this 6-spine leather jacket here, we can get an idea of what's commonly found on the shallower reefs above 20 to 30 metres, sometimes as deep as 40 metres. So these are the kelps, and these commonly form extensive beds or forests across our rocky reef in Victoria. There are two major kelp species that we find in Victoria, the common kelp, Ecklonia radiata, which we see here, and another species called Philospora comosa, which is the crabweed, which there's some of it there. So these create complex habitat that support a wide range of species, and they're also highly dynamic. So you can see them here, they move with the waves, but they also absorb a lot of that wave energy and currents and provide nice shelter for a lot of the fish and invertebrates that want to live in them. As you move into the deeper waters around Rocky Reef, the kelp starts to drop out like you can see here, and it becomes replaced with red algae, and then the algae drops out and becomes replaced by a sponge garden. That's because the light levels are too low to support plants like the algae. So these invertebrate sponge garden reefs support really colourful and beautiful fish species. This is a blue devilfish here, a kind of iconic and classic species you see diving. But if you look behind the blue devil here, this is really typical of what we see in our sponge garden reefs across Victoria. So these kind of mounding and erect sponges, lots of these zoanthid here, so a relative of the corals, forming these really vibrantly colourful sheets of life. And if you actually go down and dive on these reefs, they really do look like this, you know, and important habitats. And even things like fur seals love these reefs. These are Australian fur seals are benthic foragers, so they'll get down into these reefs to get invertebrates. Here's a little crinoid there. Support abundant invertebrate species like crabs, and they support these really complicated three-dimensional habitats for fish like this sea perch here. So this is another example of baited remote underwater video footage that we've been taking, and I'm just showing this because it gives a really nice example of the types of fish that we see in these reefs, and they do differ quite a bit from what you see in the sandy sediments. So these are really typical species on our reefs: blue-throat wrasse, Maori wrasse here, barber perch, and the thing you might notice about them is the difference in their body shape. So these round bodies that are flattened, and that's to help them get in amongst the cracks and under the algae to feed. So the diversity on the reefs of Victoria is really quite incredible and unique, and it's quite unique to the type of diversity that we see on places like the Great Barrier Reef that they're famous for. So the Great Barrier Reef obviously has fantastic diversity and it has really high species diversity, but this diversity is really captured by one particular habitat forming animal, which are the hard corals. What we have in Victoria is something that's quite different. So we have patches of reef here, and this is taken from Beware Reef. And these patches of reef have a whole range of very different animal species that all coexist together. So it's not dominated by one type. So to give you some examples of that, this is a soft coral here. So a relative of the hard corals that you find in the Great Barrier Reef, but soft if you were to touch it, hence its name. Next to it there is what we call a fan worm, this fan-like feeding structure. And if you were to pull this out, what you'd find would be a body that's attached to it that looks something like an earthworm. And these are most closely related to the earthworms that you find in your garden. Over here we have something called a feather star or a crinoid, and these are its tentacles that it's putting out there to feed. If you were to pull this animal out, what you'd find, what you'd find if you were to pull this animal out is a little round disc here, which is its body with little leg-like structures. And this thing can actually get up and swim away if it really wants to, but they prefer not to. And these are all relatives of the sea urchins and the sea stars. So very distant evolutionary lineages there. We've got sponges down here, so representing probably the most primitive way to organise complex life. And then next to them, we have an animal called an ascidian. So ascidians are actually our closest invertebrate relative. So we belong to a group of vertebrates, but our evolutionary lineage is a group called the chordates. We all have a thing called a notochord. When these guys reproduce, they make a little tadpole with a notochord that swims away, then it settles on a reef, metamorphoses into a structure like this. And these holes are its feeding appendages. And then the cycle continues. And then next to that, we've got red algae, and even up in the back here, some long fin pike, so some fish. So we have all of these creatures that are really very distantly evolutionary related, all coexisting together just on this one fantastic patch of reef. And in that sense, what we capture on our reefs is this really diverse kind of evolutionary history. So across Victoria's marine protected area network, each marine park can be quite different and contain quite distinct characteristics and configurations of habitats. So for example, there are a number of marine protected areas that occur in the marine bays, which are sheltered and are really quite different environments from the open coast here. But even among the open coast, what we find is that marine parks are really quite distinct in the way that they're configured and the habitats that they support. So I'm going to talk more specifically about two examples, Bunurong Marine National Park down here in South Gippsland, or West Gippsland, whichever way you want to cut it, and Wilson's Prom, also down in South Gippsland, West Gippsland. And I'll talk about these two because we've recently just finished a big project where we've been intensively mapping the habitats that we find in there, and we've got a really good picture of what they look like. So if you remember from my earlier slides, this is just an example of the depth profile that we find. Here's Bunurong Marine Park here. This is Wilson's Prom, and these black squiggles are the places where we've gone and actually measured the habitat to produce the more complicated map I'll show next. But a couple of key points to notice here is Bunurong is a much smaller marine park, so 2 kilometres, so it's a little bit over 2 kilometres wide. By comparison, Wilson's Prom is getting over 10 kilometres wide as it's at its widest point. Bunurong has this kind of gradual grading of shallow to deep, whereas if you look at Wilson's Prom, it's got these deep holes dotted throughout it, punctuated by areas of shallow reef. And probably I should have pointed out the colours here correspond to the depth, so red being shallow, 2 metres, blue getting deeper. But then what we find in Wilson's Prom are these islands that are jutting out. So we get these areas of really shallow islands out amongst these deeper areas all through the reef. And so this is the sort of detailed habitat map that we've produced through our mapping efforts. So these colours correspond to different habitat types, which you can see here. But I'll talk you through them more too much. What we tend to find in Wilson National Park are these extensive areas of sand. So these brown areas, sandy, yellow and tanned, are sediment communities. So we have these big kind of areas of sediment, sandy habitat. But then that's punctuated by these blue areas here, and these correspond to rocky reef, but deep rocky reef. So rocky reef where we don't get tons of algae growing on them, but instead we get these sponge gardens and the diverse fish assemblages that love them. So these islands of reef all throughout. And then what we tend to find is along the coast of the actual promontory here, these dark grey areas are where we get this rocky reef, but that's covered in kelp. So quite an interesting place, and these islands here, underwater islands of reef habitat, are real hotspots of biodiversity within this kind of sandy landscape. So by comparison, when you look at somewhere like Bunurong Marine National Park, what we have here are these brown algal dominated communities, which are shown here. Lots of kelp and other brown algae species that you can see there. So basically a seaweed reef is another way to describe it. As you move deeper, we get a different type of algal habitat, so dominated by things like red algae, which is shown here. And red algae do better. This is getting deeper, and red algae do much better in deeper waters. They're able to photosynthesize a broader range of light, and so they can exist in much deeper waters than brown algae. And then as we get deeper, that tends to fade away into these extensive areas that are made up of rhodolith beds and sandy habitats. So just looking at these two parks in detail side by side, you can see that their habitat and their configuration is really quite different. Another example is Port Phillip Heads. So this is probably our most complicated marine national park. It captures Swan Bay here, which consists of these extensive areas of seagrass beds, really stable, permanent seagrass beds there. Then we have the Heads, which is this really complicated reef that includes the old Yarra River bed before sea levels rose after the last ice age. This was all a valley with a river, and that's resulted in really complicated reef all through this area. And we also have areas like Portsea Hole, which is a little dot you can't really see there. And in the Heads and in Portsea Hole, we get these vertical walls that are covered in sponges with these beautiful fish all swimming through it. Then we have some other areas that are really quite different from everywhere else. So we have Corner Inlet here. So there's Corner Inlet Marine and Coastal Park, and nested within that Corner Inlet National Park, Marine National Park. And this area is covered in extensive seagrass beds. So it's sandy, lots of seagrass bed, and it also includes this seagrass species here called Posidonia, which is, we know that they have these huge meadows, and they're more commonly seen in Western Australia and getting up towards Queensland. They form these huge meadows, and in those areas, that's where you see dugongs grazing. But we don't get dugongs down here, so don't get too excited. But this is the southernmost extent of this species, and really it's only found in high numbers in Corner Inlet here. So really quite a unique refuge for these species, for this seagrass species. And then if you go somewhere like 90 Mile Beach Marine National Park, it's basically sand as far as we know. It mostly can the coast all up along 90 Mile. One pattern will also increases as you move from the west to the east of the state. So this map that I'm showing you here is produced from a species distribution model, which basically predicts with a good degree of accuracy the richness that we'd find in these areas using similar approaches. So using a combination of surveys of plants and animals, as well as the environmental variables that we've measured all through these areas to give us an idea of how many of the different species we'd find there. And one thing you'll probably notice is you get these patches of red. That's where we have high species richness, and then fading down to blue is where it's lower. These correspond to areas of rocky reef, which are dotted all along this network of reefs along the coast. But if we look a bit more closely, so for example, here is Discovery Bay Marine Park. This is the Discovery Bay Marine Park up here in this inset. If we compare that to Cape Howe, which is up here in the far east, we get much higher species richness on the rocky reef around Cape Howe than compared to, say, somewhere like Discovery Bay. So that's a useful pattern for us to know. So say, for example, if species richness is one thing that we're really focused on managing and protecting, then we can focus our efforts in the reefs on the east. However, there's a lot more to species richness and managing it than just that. And it's actually might not necessarily be our main focus to focus on species richness. And that's because we get quite a different range of species that occur from the east to west. So here are some examples of species that we typically find in the east of the state and in our eastern marine protected areas. So this is the eastern blue groper here, the one spot puller. And this is the black spine sea urchin. And these maps here, and sorry, I had to borrow this picture from Reef Life Survey, so I hope that's okay with them. We do collaborate with them, but I couldn't find a picture of our own there. These maps are also taken from this website here called Fishes of Australia, which is run by Museum Victoria. So this is a great resource to go and visit if you want to find out more about the incredible fish diversity that we have throughout the state. This map is a map of these fishes' distribution, and the blue is where they occur. And you can see for these two species, their distribution is in the east and then moves all the way up to the subtropics. And this is quite common for some of those species that we find in the east of the state. They're coming around the corner of Victoria, and they have a stronger preference for warmer water. They're following the warmer waters that enter Victoria. So those of you that have seen Finding Nemo may remember that the East Australia current runs down the side here, and it starts to turn into Victoria before turning back out again. And these species follow those warmer waters, and that's why we find them here. So these species are of great interest for us to watch, as these are ones that potentially will shift westward with warming sea temperatures. So we know that sea temperatures are going to warm significantly under climate change. These guys will most likely, their ranges will shift following those warmer waters. In some cases, this might not be an issue, and it may represent the new normal, something we'll have to get used to. In others, this could have major impacts, and this is likely to be the case for this species here, the black spine sea urchin. So This is capable of basically eating away all of the kelp forest and creating these areas called barrens, which are completely denuded of kelp forest, and they remove all the habitat. And we're experiencing significant problems in these areas with these species becoming overabundant. This is something we have to watch, and we are concerned that these species will keep moving west and having similar impacts in our marine protected areas there. And this again is something that Mark will talk about in his talk, Forest of the Sea, on Wednesday the 20th. So get along to that if this has piqued your interest. So there are other species that are more typical of the central and the western parts of Victoria. So these are things like the blue devilfish, the scaly fin, and the horseshoe leatherjacket. And these species are of interest to us to watch because they have this more western distribution and they have a much stronger preference for cooler water. So their response under climate change may be to move south or to seek refuges where water is cooler. And this is important for us to understand. We have two marine protected areas in Victoria, Discovery Bay and Wilson's Prom, that are likely to become future refuges under climate change. So Wilson's Prom is at the southernmost point of Victoria, so it experiences cooler waters all through there than the rest of the state and the mainland. Discovery Bay sits in an area known as the Bonnie Coast that experiences quite strong upwelling, which brings cool water from the deep sea. And these cooler areas might become important refuges for these types of species. And that's something we're watching and understanding. But there are lots of species that don't differ across the state. And perhaps one of the most interesting patterns of diversity that we have is that we see in kelp species. So these major kelp species, which basically their diversity doesn't change from all the way from southern Queensland up to around Geraldton, I think this is, in Western Australia. And what this highlights is that our reef systems in Victoria are really part of this complicated network of reefs that span across the whole southern state. And this has recently been dubbed the Great Southern Reef in recognition that this is really one continuous and highly connected ecosystem. It supports really high ecological values. It's obviously not as diverse and it hasn't got the attention that the Great Barrier Reef has, but it's a massively important ecosystem in our temperate part of the world. And this is a good example because it also highlights how Victoria's marine protected areas are part of forming and preserving this critical network that extends beyond our borders along this Great Southern Reef. So another thing that's quite important for us to learn as park managers is how our marine parks are tracking and whether they're doing their job. So one of the key questions of interest for us is whether our marine parks do actually contain representative habitats and diversity. And if we go back to my original slides, for the marine national parks and sanctuaries, that's their explicit purpose. So recently there have been really extensive habitat mapping efforts across the state that have been led by Deakin University, but funded by us as well as Victorian Environment Assessment Council and the Department of Environment. And so now we've mapped a large portion of the state. And this has allowed us to ask the question of whether our marine protected areas are representing the broader habitats that they sit within in a much more comprehensive way than we've ever been able to before. And Deakin University has just completed a really large piece of work for us, where we've used this extensive mapping to compare what's inside our marine parks to what's outside them and understand if what's inside our marine parks is actually representing those broader areas. And one of the ways that we do that is by comparing our marine reserves to the areas that are immediately around them in these areas that we call biounits. So the Victorian coast isn't all homogenous and the same, and it doesn't make sense to say compare Discovery Bay Marine National Park and the habitats that are in there to what's happening up here in Eastern Gippsland. We know they're geologically different, they experience far different climate conditions and they have different species. So what we've done is compared the Marine National Park to the habitats that are found in their broader regions that we call biounits, and biounits are areas that are all separated based on differences in the habitats and the environmental conditions that they contain. And what we've been finding is that overall our marine protected areas do represent the habitats we find in their broader regions. So there are examples of the major habitats inside most of our marine protected areas. However, what we have found is that certain habitats are proportionally represented differently in these marine protected areas. So this means that in some cases, we have a higher proportion of that marine protected area made up of a particular habitat type than you would actually find in that region outside it. So a classic example of that is that what we tend to find is that reef habitats, both the invertebrate reef and the kelp reef, are proportionally overrepresented in our marine parks and sanctuaries. And marine sanctuaries are a classic example of this. This is Ricketts Point and Merry Marine Sanctuary. Just reminding you, this is sediment here. This is rocky reef, and you can see that within our marine sanctuaries, the habitat almost entirely consists of rocky reef, and that makes sense. These are small areas that were designated around places really close to the shore and coast of particular value or environmental interest, and that's where we get a lot of our rocky reef. The marine protected areas tend to be a little bit more representative of a broader swathe of habitats, but in general we do find in our marine national parks, in our marine national parks, that reef habitat tends to be overrepresented. And what we find is that the sediment habitats tend to be proportionally underrepresented. This is particularly true of rhodolith beds and these sediment epifaunal communities. And these are generally rarer habitat types, and they haven't been that well represented in our marine protected areas. But the story is a bit more complicated than that. So there are some areas where these are really well represented, places like Point Addis and Bunurong. And there are some cases where reef isn't well represented, but as a general trend, this is what we see. So another thing that we need to understand is whether our marine protected areas are being adequately protected. And so there's been a great recent example of this in some of the work we've been doing with the southern rock lobster in partnership again with Deakin University, the marine spatial lab there. So the southern rock lobster is actually, I think it's a really stunning creature. It's a shy creature that lives in the cracks and crevices of rocky reef. It comes out at night to feed on prey, and it's ecologically and economically really important. So it's a keystone predator on reefs. It eats a wide range of species, and it can keep those grazer numbers down that can potentially become problematic. It's also Victoria's most valuable commercial fishery. I think it's currently the most valuable. It might be the second most valuable. What we've been doing is some studies of these in our marine parks, and recently we've just completed a study in Point Addis Marine Park, where with Deakin University we've undertaken comparisons of the number and the size of rock lobster inside our marine parks, comparing that to what's outside. So this is just done by throwing lobster pots in, catching the lobsters, measuring them, determining what sex they are, and then we put them back in unharmed. And at Point Addis, what we found is a really strong pattern. So just to explain this figure here, this is the number of rock lobster that are caught. This is the weight range. Inside is the grey area. Outside is the dark grey. Inside's light grey. These are females on the right here, males on the left. And with males, what we see is much larger males are found inside the marine protected area, and also a lot more of them. If you add up all of these bars, there's a lot more rock lobster inside a marine protected area. For females, they're similar sizes inside in our marine protected areas, but there's much more of them. And so this is a really great example of how our marine protected areas are protecting a commercially important species, and also how they can provide benefits beyond marine parks. So rock lobsters, when they reproduce, they actually produce a little offspring that swims off into the ocean, and it can stay there for up to a year. And then it will settle back on a remote reef somewhere else. And so by having healthy protected populations inside our marine protected areas, we're ensuring that there's a source population to resupply lobster populations outside marine parks. And this is known as the spillover effect, which is a really key benefit of marine protected areas. We've also been undertaking fish surveys at the same sites for close to 2 decades now, and this has helped us build up a really good picture of how healthy fish populations are in marine protected areas. So fish populations in MPAs are generally quite healthy, is what we're finding. And this slide shows what we call ecological control charts. So along the bottom here, we have the year that they were sampled, and each square is a year that fish were surveyed. And I should mention these are done with diver surveys who swim along using consistent methods every year and count fish and identify what species they are. The black lines here represent the abundances of fish inside the marine park. Grey is outside marine parks. Green are the numbers, the abundances of these species that we consider to represent healthy populations. Yellow, less healthy, indicative of perhaps a problem, and then red, no good, things are declining. And so I guess the key points to take away from this is that at Point Addis Marine National Park, where we've just finished a lot of monitoring, what we're finding is for a lot of these key species like the blue throat wrasse, the scaly fin, yellow striped leatherjacket, horseshoe leatherjacket here in the sea sweep, there generally is a strong pattern that numbers are higher inside our marine protected areas. And this is also, we're finding similar patterns at Port Phillip Heads Marine National Park for some of the species like the blue throat wrasse and sometimes the horseshoe leatherjacket, but a bit more complicated what's going on at Port Phillip Heads Marine National Park. But clearly some of our marine parks are having a strong benefit for these fish. Now, whether that's through protecting them from fishing or harvesting, or it's just simply because our marine parks capture good quality habitats, so we have more fish in there, is a bit unclear at the moment. But we do know that they are working to protect these species in some way. And another point I'll just note as well is for some species like the blue throat wrasse, yellow striped leatherjacket, there is a trend the horseshoe leatherjacket, there's a trend in some of our marine parks that these species have increased over time since parks were created, so further suggesting that benefit of marine protected areas. We'll be doing the same thing for key mobile invertebrates. And for them, what we found is some species are benefit, but others are not doing so well. So abalone are a key example of this. So a lot of you will be familiar with abalone. They're a large marine snail, effectively, and obviously a popular seafood, one of our major exports. They're really quite lovely creatures, even for a snail. They're shy and peaceful, just living on reefs, munching away on algae. There are two main species in Victoria, the green lip abalone, Haliovis levigata, and the black lip Haliotis rubra. What we found for the green lip is we are starting to see some good benefits of protecting them in marine protected areas. So this is Port Phillip Heads Marine National Park here, and what we've seen is over time green lip has increased in the park, and there's also much higher numbers inside the park compared to outside. This is Point Addis here, so the pattern's not so clear. So this is certainly a more complex story than just that, but we are seeing benefits in some areas. So by contrast, with Haliotis rubra, the blacklip abalone, we've seen a long-term decline in this species, both inside our marine national parks and outside. We're still seeing some benefit of protection in the marine national parks, but in general, this seems to be an overall trend and a statewide trend from some more recent work that we've done that this species is declining. And so this is of concern to us, and it's not clear exactly what's driving this decline. They're not harvested in marine national parks, so it doesn't seem to be anything to do with over harvesting or anything like that. It seems to be an environmental cause. It could be linked to this next pattern that I'm going to describe, and this is one of the more concerning patterns that we're seeing in our marine protected areas, which is that in a lot of places we're seeing a general decline in kelp species across the state. So again, this is taken from our most recently completed monitoring programs at Point Addis and Port Phillip Heads. These ecological control charts are telling us the same thing as previously. The measure here, though, is the percentage cover. So if you look at a rock, what percentage of that rock is covered with algae? This is the common kelp, that major habitat forming species. And what we've seen at Point Addis is a serious long-term decline to it almost not being present. We've also seen similar declines at Port Phillip Heads Marine National Park, but it has bounced back recently. For the crabweed, the other dominant species, at Point Addis, we've actually seen an increase. So this could be actually recolonised in occupying space where a colonia has disappeared, but it's still a very small percent cover. So we've lost a lot of algae from Point Addis, and this is shown by this overall measure for all of the canopy forming brown algae. So species in addition to these have shown a general long-term decline. Similar things been seen for the crabweed in Port Phillip Heads, an overall long-term decline. And this is of concern to us given its importance of a habitat. And in some cases, we have a good handle on probably what is driving this decline. So we know that in the east of the state and in places like Port Phillip Bay, overabundant urchins are just munching their way through these kelp forests and causing quite a lot of loss there. And this is something that we're actively managing at Parks Victoria. We've been going out and managing urchins, and we've actually been seeing some great results, which Mark will talk about in his presentation on Wednesday. So again, another plug, get along to that to find out more there. But in the west of the state, it's not really clear what's causing this decline in kelp. We suspect it's to do with something to do with climate change. It could be related to disease. It could be related to increasing water temperatures or even increasing wave energy and storm energy. One of the last things I'd just like to show you is some of the things that we find in our marine national parks are just nice and exciting to find. So using only monitoring techniques, occasionally we're able to find and see really rare and unusual things. So I'll just play this video and I hope it comes through to you, and keep your eye out and see if you can spot what I'm talking about. So moving along the back here, what you can see is a grey nurse shark. So on the east coast of Australia, this is a critically endangered species, and it's not super well known to be in Victoria. So this species is more commonly found up around central New South Wales areas, well known from around places like Byron Bay and Julian Rocks. It's only been officially recorded in Victoria a few times, although anecdotally we think that this is probably seen a lot more commonly around Cape Howe. And it's just really neat to see this endangered and rare species utilising our marine parks. I think I forgot to mention that this is Cape Howe Marine Park. We've seen this right there in the far east of Victoria. And this is an example here of these urchin barrens that get created. This would normally be covered in kelp, but this black spine sea urchin's eaten most of it away, to give you an idea of what we mean. So what's in store for the future? Well, we know that the world is changing and quite rapidly, and this is particularly true in the ocean, where we know that sea surface temperatures are increasing, and they have already increased by about 1 degree in the last century. And with this becomes sea level rise, comes increased wave energy and storm surges, and then we have the shifts in the ranges of species that are more suited to warmer waters. And so we're starting to see some signs of change and impact, like kelp loss. But in the future, we've really got to be watching out and keeping monitoring to understand what these changes mean and what are the things that we need to manage. So our monitoring critically needs to be able to point towards management actions that we need to take. And so a really important question for us will be to understand what we need to manage, what are the changes that we'll have to accept, and also to identify those critical areas that require protection within our MPAs. And that's with the focus of ensuring that we can preserve these fantastic marine environments in the best condition that we can. So thank you. Hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight to some of the work we're doing, as well as the wonderful marine life and diversity that we find in our marine protected areas. That's it for me, Mark. So we can probably jump to some Q&A.
Great presentation. Thanks, Michael. There's a lot of comments just saying how wonderful it is to see some of the imagery there. Fantastic. Got a question first, which might be a good one to just sort of talk about more broadly, is sure. Pat from Rice asks, great pres, are there seagrass or reefs on the Mornington Peninsula or in Port Phillip Bay that are relatively easy to find?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So Port Phillip Bay is an interesting one. So it is a bit of a sandy, flat plain, but if you want to see seagrass, go to somewhere like Swan Bay, which isn't on the Mornington Peninsula, but if you can get across there, extensive seagrass beds there. Off Blairgowrie, down on the peninsula, there's quite a lot of seagrass bed there. Those seagrasses tend to come and go, so they can be hard to find.
Sorry, Michael, he was actually asking about reefs and sponges. That was my mistake, my bad writing.
Oh, reefs and sponges, yeah. Okay, well, that's different. So in Port Phillip Bay, yes. I mean, the Port Phillip Heads area is absolutely fantastic place to go and see these reefs and sponges. So you have to dive there and get out on a boat, and you do have to deal with the rip. So you have to get in and out in about an hour, but a lot of the photos that you've seen today, like with those blue devils and those yellow zoanthids, are exactly what you find in Port Phillip Heads. So off Point Nepean National Park, but the easier side to get to that stuff is generally off Point Lonsdale. Yes, so yeah. And I should mention, sorry, there are some other great examples like Ricketts Point. So up near Beaumaris is a fantastic place on that side to go and see marine life. And that's really accessible from the shore. You can get in and have a snorkel and you'll see lots of those fantastic algal reefs and a little bit of the sponge gardens, but not as much there because it's shallower.
And just another one to throw in is the magnificent Mushroom Reef Marine Sanctuary just near Flinders, which of course, yeah, is a pretty popular spot. It's a bit harder to get in because of the conditions quite often, but when you do get the chance, it's a magnificent snorkel. Yep. Another question. This is from Jonah, and he's again great presentation. Wondering, was particularly interested in your comments about seagrass as carbon sinks, and the question, to paraphrase, is what's being done to create more of these areas, to employ more of these areas to help in that process of storing and capturing carbon? And a second part to the question is, are they resilient to warming sea temperatures? So maybe you can have a crack at that one.
Yeah, good questions. So seagrasses are a bit tricky. So there's a lot of work being done to protect them. One of the issues with seagrasses is actually to do with water quality. So they live near the coast. So one of the biggest threats to them is actually too much sediment and pollution coming in, and in particular sediment. And so not us at Parks Victoria, but Melbourne Water, as one example, are doing a lot of work to actually manage the sediment that comes into places like Western Port. So Western Port used to have extensive seagrass beds that are being lost, and a lot of those actions, and this will benefit our marine parks in there. So we have Yoringa Marine Park and French Island in there where there's seagrass beds. And so those types of actions really do benefit seagrass beds, but they take time and they're difficult. There's also some work being done around in terms of actively restoring them, but seagrasses are tricky. A couple of the other habitats that I didn't mention because they're not in the water or underwater, this was more focused underwater, but mangroves and salt marsh are also a really important part of the blue carbon ecosystem. So they're in that intertidal area, and there's a lot of work being done to restore those blue carbon ecosystems in Parks Victoria land as well. And they're a little bit more straightforward than seagrass. And yeah, look, actually another example is in Corner Inlet, there's a lot of work being done to try and restore these Posidonia beds. So we've seen some loss. So there's active community groups, the land care groups that are in Corner Inlet who are actively trying to transplant and regrow those Posidonia beds. So
and sorry,
was that the whole question?
Question about resilience to warming temperatures. How seagrass is going to survive?
It's a good question. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that one that well. So I think that it's not an issue that's spoken about a lot in terms of seagrasses being able to withstand warming temperatures, because they are in shallower water. They experience much more, a much greater range of temperatures. So a lot of these deeper systems that are in deeper water, temperature doesn't actually change that much. It's quite stable the deeper you go. So they're less capable of responding to changes. Whereas as you get shallower, those systems do tend to be able to withstand a lot of different ranges. The things that can harm seagrasses are like in the intertidal areas. If there's a low tide and then you get a really hot sunny day, it can burn them off. So that is something that can impact seagrasses. But the other thing about seagrasses is they grow really quickly and they're able to recover from disturbance quite quickly. So where you have impacts like that, you usually see particular species of seagrass coming back quite rapidly.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to add, because we're getting close to time, might combine a couple of questions, one from Alistair and another one from, sorry, I just lost it there, from Ian Robertson. To paraphrase the questions, do we need more marine protected areas, and are there any plans to increase the size of the marine parks?
Well, it's an interesting question. So we don't have any plans. I suppose I better answer this one tactfully, because we're the managers of marine protected areas. We don't create new ones. There's two interesting things about this though. So there's two targets. There's a target called the HE target, which Australia signed on to, which was to protect 10% of coastal waters, and we've hit that target in Victoria by protecting 11%. Australia, the country, has recently been a signatory to another target, which is to protect 30% of marine environments and marine protected areas. So I suppose there is some sense that we might try and protect more areas, but how we do that is not necessarily clear. So that's kind of around expanding them, but there's no immediate plans that I'm aware of. And what was the second part to that question, Mark?
Pretty much the same. Are there going to be more of them? So pretty much the same.
Yeah, I think that answers that question. Yep.
Indeed. Look, again, I'm just conscious we've got probably 2 minutes left. A couple of questions again, one from Jock about community involvement in protecting areas such as in removal of urchins. And there's another one which relates to citizen science from Hannah. talking about getting peeps out in the water with cameras to help monitor and contribute. What's the role, if I can put those two together, how can citizen scientists or how can our communities help us in looking after these areas?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I mean, some of the citizen science groups around and citizen groups around the state have been instrumental in protecting these areas. So the Friends of groups, there's lots of them around. And so if you're interested in it, they're great to join. And there's examples that are happening right now, for example, the Friends of Ricketts Point and places like that who are looking to get involved in culling urchins because urchins are getting a bit out of hand there. And so, you know, they're a great additional resource for us. And I mean, more than that, they are the custodians of a lot of those areas themselves. And then we run a lot of citizen science monitoring programs as well. We have a sea search program that people can join up, and our rangers run those programs. They take people out, and that really helps them engage with marine areas and intertidal areas, and we can use that data to inform our management. Mark, I might throw this one back to you as well, because you're very prominent in running our marine citizen science stuff. So what have you got to add?
Yeah, look, that's absolutely right. So Sea Search is one great opportunity. There's also some other fantastic programs run by other organisations that do tend to have a little bit of a focus in the marine protected areas as well. So programs like Reef Watch, activities like the Great Victorian Fish Count, the Sea Slug Census. And for those scuba divers out there with a bit of experience, there's another wonderful national program called Reef Life Survey. So yeah, Google's, there's a great, some great resources that you can find online. We've got links to quite a lot of them on the individual pages. And if you look in the science section of our website, you'll be able to find some links there as well. Michael, we might have to wrap it up there. It is now 6 o'clock. I do have one or two other questions, which if Claire in particular wanted to get more information about rays. Again, Claire, I just encourage you to get contact with the Marine Care Point Cook, the leader of that group. Wonderful Andrew Christie has developed a guide. If you're happy to post your email in the chat, I will send you a copy of that. That's a beautiful little guide, again, done by somebody who's got a personal interest in rays. And I think that's it. But look, I think I might just take Pat from Rise. Final comment there. He said, awesome presentation, Michael. Thanks heap for the great work you and your teams are doing in looking after such critical marine resources for us and future generations. So I think that's a huge compliment.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, thank you.
All right, perhaps we'll leave it there. Do you want to close off?
Sure, I will. So look, thanks everyone for joining us. That'll end the presentation. I did also just see, Mark, in the comments a few people asking about whether we're recording this and whether they can get it. And we are recording it, and we'll send it out to the attendees, a link for people that want to access the recording and share it around. So thanks very much for joining us, and get along to Mark's talk on Wednesday as well, because there's going to be even more nice footage and photos.
Thanks, Michael. Fantastic.
Thanks.